With development pressures, climate change and declining space for connectivity across the Greater Sydney Basin and beyond, there is an increasing need for restorationists, plant producers, planners and landscape architects to collaborate on ensuring natives of the correct provenance and genetics are conserved as well as planted within urban spaces.
I'm now going to introduce Katie Littlejohn, who's the Area Manager for National Parks and Wildlife Services Cumberland area. And the Park Services manage 20 reserves across Western Sydney from near Wisemans Ferry to Wilton. Prior to this, Katie worked as a ranger, mainly focused on new reserves, including the establishment of Wianamatta Regional Park at the former Australian Defence Industries site at St Mary's. Background in forestry with a mixture of commercial operations and land management for conservation. Over to you, Katie.
Hi everyone. So reaching for the sky at Schyeville. So we just touched on this. The Cumberland area manages most of Western Sydney, so the majority of the Cumberland Plain. We manage just over 5,000 hectares and we've got some new reserves coming online in the next 12 months. What's important to note about these reserves are that most of them have at least 3 to 5 threatened ecological communities and at least 80% of each reserve has these TECs. But having said that, all of the vegetation is disturbed and the majority of that vegetation is regrowth. So we've talked a lot about this already today. The Cumberland Plain has a long history of disturbance. What I wanted to show you here with the aerial photos, this is the former ADI site at Penrith. It's now called Wianamatta Regional Park, the areas that will be conserved. The top photo is a picture from the 1940s. The bottom photo is a picture that was taken this month. You can see how much the vegetation has regenerated. And what is really good to see here is that there has been no human intervention. So today's talk is about Schyeville National Park. It also has had a long history of disturbance. So in the early 1800s, it was the pit town common. There was lots of clearing, early settlement, logging and grazing. We moved to the early 1900s. It was a dreadnought training farm. This became a more intensive agricultural phase, so a lot more cropping and ploughing. Time went on, and in the 60s and 70s there was an officer training unit for the army and a lot of playing fields were established with turf. So during this period of time we ended up with lots of weeds. The dominant ones at Schyeville are African olive, and fortunately we've been able to have a lot of success here with our volunteer program. But we also have a lot of introduced grasses, which is what we're talking about today. One of those is African lovegrass. And they've really changed the landscape. So over the last 18 years, we've done a lot of adaptive management trials, and I'm really pleased that some of my colleagues here today, so Jonathan Sanders, Charles Morris, Paul Gibson-Roy and Samantha Craigie have had a lot to do with that. And so I want to talk about this, but there's a lot of content and I'm going to have to be quick, so I apologise for how fast I'll have to go. So the first one we looked at was the impact of fire. So we did trials using fire in the African lovegrass areas. The first burn removed a lot of the material, which was great, and we did get native seed germination, but we also got a lot of introduced species come back. We followed up with a second burn, and that balance changed. We ended up with a lot more native species germination, so it was really encouraging results. However, by changing nothing, 10 years later, we're back to a dominant introduced species pasture. We then tried something else. A student from Western Sydney University added sugar to some plots, and so we burnt those areas and then we followed up with the sugar. Again, there was really promising results showed here because by adding carbon to the soil, it promoted native species recruitment, which was a really good outcome, as you can see in the photos. We also had trials looking at herbicide and fire treatments. So task force was applied, and then we would do burns 6 to 8 weeks later. Again, that had really promising results. In those areas, so former cropping sites, for example, we still had a native seed bank in the soil, so we did see native species germinate following that. However, in those areas where we had significant disturbance, so former sporting fields, there wasn't much seed bank left, and so we didn't see any recruitment. So then we moved to some of the work that Paul and Samantha did. So we were really fortunate to have an opportunity to have a filming company come into Schyeville and wanted to recreate Vietnam. And so they came in and scalped some dirt for free, which was awesome, on an old sporting field. And we took the opportunity there because it is an expensive method, but we were able to plant the subsoil with these native species. So you can see that we planted 70 to 80 species, and we've got excellent results from that. So that was about 3 to 4 years ago now. Many of the species have flowered and have seeded a number of times. We're getting higher density there. We do get some individual lovegrass plants come back into that site. But what's good is that it's easy for us to manage that by doing some regular maintenance. So what worked really well in those areas is that we can restore in a completely altered environment. So I wanted to touch on this because I think this is important and we don't really ever talk about it. So we have learnt some lessons over the years. One is that herbicide application as a standalone is really not that effective. So, for example, as you can see in the top photo here, we've applied task force in lots of areas. It kills the lovegrass, which is great, but it leaves a lot of biomass behind. There's no room for the native species to germinate in that environment. There's been other sites where nothing has grown back as a result. Another big one for us that's actually happened in a number of our reserves, unfortunately, is that we've had mass tube stock planting not work. So that photo down the bottom there shows what's happened. And so all we've really ended up with is a rubbish situation in a lot of our parks where we had the bamboo sticks and the tree guards left behind and no trees. And that's, probably a result of poor planning and not being able to do the planting in an opportune time. So issues to do with time of year and inadequate watering. We have big problems with macropod browsing and inadequate site preparation. So, using volunteers or Green Army to dig holes by hand, I have found not to work very well. So bringing it all together with our trials, we're about to work with Western Sydney University once again to further some of the work that we've done already. So we're going to be doing treatments with a mixture of herbicide, fire, carbon addition and native grassland seeding. So this time it's not focusing on those sculpted areas, it's more on those areas that have been previously treated in task force, and we're hoping to come up with combinations that we can apply easily across the landscape at Scheyville. So in summary, Scheyville shows that restoration of native vegetation is possible and achievable in areas that are heavily disturbed. It does involve using a range of techniques as appropriate, so recognising and encouraging the innate regenerative capacity of native species, correction of soil problems, removal and control of introduced species inhibiting native regeneration, and addition of native ground cover seed to enhance the remnant seed bank. So finally, I'd just like to say, Scheyville shows that species diversity is deficient in areas despite our best efforts to restore the landscape. Western Sydney vegetation tends to be highly rainfall dependent, so seeding with native seed helps to establish those seed banks that are missing. and can respond a lot better to changes in climatic conditions, and so tube stock may not be as appropriate in those situations. So seeding using those supportive techniques is really our only guarantee of success for large-scale restoration in Western Sydney. And when I say that, I am talking about our reserves in terms of the long-term maintenance of these areas. So if we can support the growth of the native seed industry in New South Wales, I think it will also be our most cost-effective tool into the future. Thank you.